Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We often talk about thinking like a philosopher or maybe even acting as philosophers in our daily lives. But what does that really look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the abstract ideas, right?
Totally. But today we're going to dive into a historical example that really brings this idea of acting as philosophers to life. We're talking about the School of Salamanca.
Ah, yes. The School of Salamanca, a group of thinkers in 16th and 17th century Spain and Portugal. Really fascinating period.
And for this deep dive, we're relying on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and entry on the School of Salamanca.
Great source. Really comprehensive and gives a solid overview of these figures.
Absolutely. So these weren't just armchair philosophers, pondering things in isolation. These were theologians and legal scholars who found themselves smack dab in the middle of a world that was rapidly changing.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a time of upheaval. Global empires on the rise, encounters with new cultures in the Americas, the Protestant Reformation shaking up religious unity, and the beginnings of a global economy. Big stuff.
Huge. And these thinkers, they didn't shy away from it. They took their knowledge, their philosophical tools, and they waded right into the thick of it.
Exactly. They didn't just want to understand these changes. They wanted to figure out, how do we respond? How do we act ethically and justly in this new world?
So that's our mission in this deep dive, to understand how they acted as philosophers. How did they use established wisdom, yet also find ways to innovate and create new ways of thinking to tackle these unprecedented challenges? And what can we learn from their approach, even today, in our own complex world?
It's a great question. And I think to really appreciate how they did that, we need to start with, well, where it all began. Salamanca itself.
Right. The University of Salamanca, one of the oldest universities in Europe,
Mm.
dating back to the 12th century, formally recognized as a university in the 13th century. So much history there.
Centuries of tradition. For a long time, education at Salamanca was very traditional. Lectures focused on authoritative texts. Pretty standard stuff.
Okay, so kind of a classic approach.
Sure.
But things started to change, right? What happened?
Yeah, well, in the 15th century, you start to see this intellectual energy bubbling up. There's this real excitement about engaging with ideas in a new way.
Got it. So what did that look like in practice?
Well, take a figure like Juan de Segovia. He was involved in the Council of Basel, advocating for the power of councils over the Pope. Quite a controversial stance at the time.
Yeah, definitely stirring things up. And he was also open to dialogue with the Islamic world. Very forward-thinking for that era.
Right. And then you have someone like Alfonso de Sada Madrigal. He supported more popular forms of government, which was a pretty radical idea when monarchies were the norm. And he didn't hold back from criticizing, the actions of the clergy.
So these were individuals willing to question the status quo, already
Wow.
exhibiting that philosophical spirit.
And
Absolutely. So you've got this intellectual ferment at Salamanca, and then the Dominican order arrives and establishes a strong presence there, particularly through the convent of San Esteban.
Okay, so the Dominicans enter the picture. How does that factor in?
The establishment of their Studium Generale in 1299 was a big deal. They eventually gained control of many of the theology positions, and they became, these centers of learning and debate.
Got it. So they're adding to this intellectual energy at Salamanca.
Exactly. But the figure who really embodies the spirit of the School of Salamanca, the one who truly sparked this tradition of acting as philosophers in response to the changing world, is Francisco de Vitoria. He arrived in 1524, and things really took off from there.
Vittoria. Okay, I've heard the name. Tell me more about him. What made him so influential?
Well, Vittoria led this revival of Thomism, the philosophical and theological system of Thomas Aquinas. But here's the key. He didn't treat Aquinas as this, untouchable dogma.
Yeah, I mean, Aquinas was writing centuries earlier. The world had changed a lot.
Exactly. So Vittoria, he took Aquinas's insights and applied them creatively to the very real problems of the 16th century. He even went against university rules by using Aquinas's Summa Theology as a primary textbook.
Old move. So Vittoria is really bridging that gap between established wisdom and these new realities.
Absolutely. And think about the challenges they were facing. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, the encounter with indigenous peoples and their cultures, the rise of a global economy. tragically entangled with the slave trade, and the Protestant Reformation causing this huge rift in the Christian world. These weren't just theoretical issues. These were real-life problems that needed real-life solutions.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just intellectual exercises for them. Many of these thinkers were confessors and advisors to powerful figures, even to the emperor.
Right, they were right there in the mix of it. Involved in the politics, the economics, the legal decisions, they had to put their philosophy into action.
It makes their philosophical work so much more compelling, right?
Mhm.
Because it had to have real-world implications.
Right. It had to be grounded in reality. They were trying to figure out how to act justly and ethically in a world that was changing before their eyes.
Okay, so we've talked about the context, the historical backdrop, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. What were their core philosophical approaches?
Well, Thomas Aquinas was definitely a major influence, as we've discussed. But they weren't just blindly following him.
Right, they were critical thinkers. How did they balance that respect for tradition with the need to innovate and address these new challenges?
Well, what's really fascinating is that they engaged with the whole spectrum of medieval thought, not just Aquinas. They drew from thinkers like Gratian in law, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham in metaphysics, even figures like Marsilius of Padua, who had some pretty controversial views.
So they were open to different perspectives.
Yeah, and they were willing to debate, to question, to reinterpret. They weren't afraid to disagree with established authorities if their analysis of the issues demanded it. You know, that's a hallmark of truly acting philosophically, right? That willingness to challenge assumptions.
Absolutely. So they're acting as philosophers in this broader intellectual context. And one area where this really came to the forefront was in theology, particularly in their response to the Protestant Reformation. Talk about a challenge to the established order.
Right. The rise of Lutheranism forced them to re-examine fundamental doctrines like justification, the role of the sacraments, the authority of the priesthood, the whole concept of free will.
Wow, yeah. Those are some pretty foundational theological questions. How do they approach these?
Well, Vittoria, for example, he was a strong defender of papal authority, but he wasn't afraid to criticize practices within the church, like the selling of indulgences. He saw a need for reform.
Interesting. So he's balancing loyalty to the church with a commitment to truth and what he saw as necessary reform.
Exactly. And within Catholicism itself, there were some pretty intense internal debates going on, particularly between the Dominicans and the Jesuits.
I've heard a bit about that. Something about grace and free will, right? Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, so the Dominicans, they emphasized God's absolute power and this idea of predeterminatio physica, like predestination. Whereas the Jesuits, they really stressed human free will and this concept of scientia media. It's God's knowledge of the choices that free individuals would make.
Okay, so different conceptions of how divine knowledge and human freedom interact sounds pretty complex.
It is, and it's not just theological hair-splitting either. These debates delve into the very nature of causality, human agency, divine sovereignty. I mean, these are huge philosophical questions. And even the fact that some aspects of this De Auxiliis controversy, as it was called, were eventually censored just shows you how high the stakes were.
Yeah, I see what you mean. These weren't just abstract ideas. They had real implications for how people understood their relationship with God, with the church, with the world.
Exactly. And you see figures like Suarez trying to find a middle ground with his congruism. So all these debates, they really push them to think deeply and to articulate their positions with clarity and precision.
So they're acting as philosophers in theology, trying to grapple with these fundamental religious and philosophical questions. But their influence went far beyond that, right? Particularly in law and politics. They're considered foundational figures in the development of international law. How did they apply their philosophical approach to these areas?
Well, they took the existing tradition of natural law, which was heavily influenced by Aquinas, and they transformed it to address the very real political and legal dilemmas of their time, especially those arising from European expansion. They were moving beyond just commentary on Aquinas and developing practical frameworks for how different peoples and nations should interact.
It's like they saw a need to bridge the gap between these timeless principles and these new global realities.
Exactly. And this is a prime example of acting as philosophers. They're not just theorizing in a vacuum, they're taking these abstract principles and applying them to concrete situations.
Okay, so let's dig into their understanding of natural law a bit. Aquinas had that hierarchical view of law, right? Eternal law, divine law, natural law, human law. How did the thinkers of Salamanca build upon that framework?
Well, Vittoria, for instance, he really emphasized that natural law is accessible to all people through reason, regardless of their religious beliefs. It's this source of universal moral principles that can be used to judge the actions of rulers and nations.
So a kind of universal moral code based on reason. That's a powerful idea.
It is, and Suarez, he develops this further, arguing that natural law specifically governs beings with free will. It's tied to individual conscience, so there's this focus on reason and individual agency that becomes really important.
It sounds like they're expanding on Aquinas' ideas in some significant ways.
They are, and Vittoria, he also stresses the moral content of natural law. He talks about things like the obligation to keep promises, the golden rule. He's further grounding their ethical and legal reasoning in these fundamental moral principles.
Got it. So they're refining and expanding upon this concept of natural law. And then there's this idea of the Alpheus Gentium that emerges. It sounds like they're starting to distinguish it more clearly from natural law. What's the difference, and why is this important?
Yeah, the separation of Alpheus Gentium from natural law was crucial for addressing things like property rights and how different societies interact with each other. They saw Alpheus Gentium as not immutable principles from nature, but more like positive laws or customs established by the agreement of different nations.
Okay, so it's more about the agreements between nations, whereas natural law is more foundational.
Right. So natural law provides a kind of general framework, but Aequus Gentium offers more specific rules for things like trade, diplomacy, and, yes, even slavery, which was a very contentious issue. This distinction allowed them to acknowledge that, different cultures have different customs and agreements, but those still need to be evaluated against a broader standard of natural justice.
That makes sense. And within this whole legal and political framework, they also debated this concept of dominium, which seems to cover both property rights and political authority. What were their different perspectives on this?
Well, thinkers like Soto and Molina, they lean on Aristotle and Aquinas to argue for private property. They thought it encouraged productivity and responsibility, ultimately serving the common good.
Okay, so private property is a positive force in society.
But then you have figures like Azpilicueta who were much more skeptical. He even questioned how far the obligation to help those in need goes if it infringes on property rights. So there's this real tension there.
It shows how they were really grappling with the nuances of these concepts.
Absolutely. They weren't just accepting things at face value. They were dissecting these fundamental concepts, exploring the implications from different angles.
And this is where this idea of subjective right, Arius, becomes prominent in their legal arguments. How did they develop this concept, and why was it important?
Well, the idea of subjective rights had roots in earlier medieval thought, but the school of Salamanca really fleshed it out. Molina, for example, he defined inxulis as this power or faculty that individuals have, and any violation of it without just cause constitutes an injury.
So it's about recognizing the inherent entitlements of individuals.
Exactly. And this is a really significant step because it provides a philosophical basis for defending individual rights, even against powerful authorities. And one of the most striking examples of this is the argument that even slaves possess anxius qua homo, a right simply because they're human.
Wow, that's a powerful statement, especially in the context of the time.
It is, and it shows how they were grappling with the application of these principles in a very real and challenging situation.
Which brings us to the really complex and ethically challenging issue of slavery, particularly in the New World. They didn't have a modern understanding of race, but they were confronted with the enslavement of indigenous populations and the transatlantic slave trade. How did they engage with this?
Yeah, this is a very difficult and often troubling aspect of their legacy. While they didn't have a fully developed concept of race, as we do today, racial considerations did enter their discussions, especially when they were trying to categorize the different people they encountered in the Americas.
Right, so there's this attempt to understand these new populations.
But unfortunately, some later figures like Sandoval and Avendaño, they used biblical interpretations like the Curse of Noah to justify the enslavement of Africans.
That's, yeah, really problematic.
It is. But it's important to note that prominent figures like Molina and Soto rejected the idea of natural slavery outright. They argued that no one is born a slave by nature. Instead, they focused on the conventional justifications for slavery within the existing legal and social systems. And they often found those justifications lacking.
So even though they didn't arrive at a complete condemnation of slavery as a whole, they were challenging the basis of it. They were applying their philosophical principles to a deeply troubling practice.
They were pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable to even question at the time.
And this leads us to their engagement with colonialism and war, particularly the work of Francisco de Vitoria, who's considered a key figure in early international law. How did he exemplify the School of Salamanca acting as philosophers on a global scale?
Vittoria's work, especially his relections on the Indies, De Indies and the Irabelli, is groundbreaking. He directly challenged the justifications for Spanish conquest, arguing that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were very domini, true owners of their lands and possessions.
He recognized their inherent rights.
He did, and he argued that they had legitimate political authority, regardless of their religion or whether they conformed to European ideas of rationality. This was a huge challenge to the prevailing colonial ideology and those Aristotelian notions of natural slavery. He was applying natural law and integus gentium to this unprecedented situation.
He's acting as a philosopher who's willing to question the actions of his own society based on these universal ethical principles.
Exactly. And he went through very systematically what he considered unjust titles for waging war against the indigenous peoples. He refuted arguments based on the emperor or the pope having universal dominion, the idea that discovery gave them the right to conquer, the forced conversion of indigenous people, claims that they were committing sins against nature, even the idea that they had somehow voluntarily submitted.
Wow, so he's dismantling all these commonly used justifications.
He is. He argued that none of these provided a legitimate basis for conquest or taking away the rights of the indigenous populations.
But he did outline some just titles for war, didn't he? And some of those, from a modern perspective, seem problematic.
Yeah, it's important to engage with those critically. Some of the just titles he outlined were the right to travel and trade freely, the right to preach the gospel peacefully, the right to protect innocent people from tyranny, even the right to intervene if indigenous rulers were harming their own people.
Okay, so a mixed bag. Some principles we might still uphold today, and others that are clearly problematic.
Right. And his justification for intervening partly as slaves is particularly disturbing. It really reflects the limitations of their understanding within the context of their time. He also argued that once a large number of indigenous people had converted to Christianity, Spain had a responsibility to protect them, which implied continued Spanish presence and control. So, while he's trying to establish an ethical framework for colonialism, you can see the tensions between his ideals and the realities of colonial power.
It's a reminder that even the most brilliant thinkers are products of their time.
Absolutely. And they grapple with the limitations of their own understanding.
The School of Salamanca also further developed the theory of just war, right, building on Aquinas's work.
Yeah, Vittoria and other thinkers, like Molina, elaborated on the criteria for a just war. They emphasized legitimate authority, so war could only be declared by a sovereign power. Just cause, meaning self-defense, recovering stolen goods, punishment for wrongdoing. Notably, they excluded religious difference as a sole justification, and they stressed the right intention, promoting good and avoiding greater evil, and proportionality, so the harm caused by the war shouldn't outweigh the good achieved. Vittoria also explicitly condemned the enslavement of captured Christians and starting wars just to take slaves.
So a pretty comprehensive framework for thinking about the ethics of war.
It was. And Molina, he added this interesting subjective dimension, acknowledging that both sides in a conflict might genuinely believe they have a just cause.
That adds a whole layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It does, because even if you have these objective criteria, determining whether they're met in any given situation can be incredibly difficult.
And the concept of veritas gentium continued to evolve, too. Suarez made further refinements, right?
He did. Suarez further clarified the distinction between natural law and intus gentium, dividing it into inus supra gentes, which is like a law above all nations, derived from natural law, and inus inter gentes, which is law between nations based on customs and agreements. This was really important for understanding how international norms and practices develop.
So he's adding more nuance to this concept of international law.
Exactly. And he emphasized that inus gentium as a form of positive law was what governed things like property rights and the institution of slavery on the international stage.
Interesting. So even though natural law might condemn slavery, inus gentium, as it existed at the time, still allowed for it.
It did. And that shows the tension between these different levels of law and how challenging it can be to apply these principles in a complex world.
Okay, so we've talked about their views on war, natural law, exequis gentium. What about their views on waging war, specifically against non-Christians? Was that ever considered justified?
There was a pretty strong consensus against waging war on non-Christians solely because of their religion, but there were exceptions.
Okay, so what were those exceptions?
The main exceptions were for violations of natural law that they considered so egregious, so offensive to humanity as a whole, that they justified intervention. Things like cannibalism or human sacrifice. Molina, he also had a nuanced view on the right to free commerce. He argued that you couldn't just use military force to enforce it.
So there were limits to intervention, even in the pursuit of economic interests.
Right, and I think that shows a growing awareness of the complexities of international relations.
We also have to mention that famous debate at the Junta of Valladolid, Sepulveda versus Las Casas. It really brought these philosophical debates to the forefront of the colonial situation.
It did. Sepulveda, he argued for the natural inferiority of the indigenous populations. He drew on Aristotle to claim that some people are just naturally meant to be slaves. Las Casas, of course, passionately opposed this view. He argued that the indigenous people were rational and deserved respect and dignity.
I can only imagine how heated that debate must have been.
Oh, I'm sure it was. And Domingo de Soto, who was also there, he emphasized the role of redis gentium in regulating trade and even slavery, but he rejected forced conversion as a justification for enslavement.
So you see these different strands of thought within the school of Salamanca coming together, clashing, trying to grapple with this incredibly complex and morally challenging situation.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of the School of Salamanca acting as philosophers, wrestling with fundamental questions of human nature, rights, justice, all in the face of a really difficult ethical challenge.
It's so fascinating how their work spans so many different areas, and we haven't even talked about their contributions to economics yet. I find it so interesting that they're considered early theorists of monetarist economics and even forerunners of the Austrian school.
Mm.
What were their economic ideas and how did their philosophical framework shape their thinking in this area?
Well, their approach to economics was really grounded in natural law and ethics. They weren't just interested in how markets work. They wanted to understand how they should work justly.
Right, so a moral dimension to economics.
Absolutely. And this led them to address issues like fair pricing, usury, public finance. Their economic thought wasn't purely theoretical. It was driven by a concern for fairness and the common good.
That's so different from how economics is often viewed today.
It is, and they developed some pretty sophisticated economic theories for their time. They had this subjective theory of value, where the value of something is determined by how people value it in the marketplace, not just its cost of production or its utility.
Interesting. So the market plays a key role in determining value.
Right. And Martín de Espulqueda, he's credited with an early formulation of the quantity theory of money. He observed the connection between the influx of gold and silver from the Americas and rising prices in Spain. They even developed an early understanding of purchasing power parity in exchange rates.
So they're making some real advances in economic thought. What were their views on monopolies and things like interest rates?
Molina, he was generally against monopolies. He thought they distorted prices and harmed consumers. As for interest rates, they developed justifications for certain forms of interest, which was traditionally condemned as usury. They used concepts like lucrum cessans, the loss of potential profit from lending money, and periculum sortis, the risk the lender takes.
So they're finding ways to justify certain practices that had long been considered unethical.
But it's important to remember that their understanding of the market was embedded in this broader moral and social context. They didn't see economic activity as purely transactional. It was all part of this web of ethical obligations.
Yeah, that makes sense. So a very different view from the kind of detached, purely self-interested model of economic behavior that we often see today.
It is, and it's a reminder that economics can't be separated from ethical considerations.
Now, before we wrap up, we should mention their contributions to logic and metaphysics, even though these areas might be less well known.
Definitely. Domingo de Soto's work in logic is seen as a defense of Thomism against the rising tide of nominalism. He wrote this text called Sumulae, which was a systematic treatment of terms, propositions, arguments.
So keeping that Thomas tradition alive in logic.
Right. And then you have Francisco Suarez's Disputationes Metaphysicae, which was this huge influential work that tried to synthesize Aquinas and Duns Scotus. It covered everything from the nature of being to causality to the categories of existence. And it had a huge impact on later thinkers like Descartes and Leibniz.
Wow, so influencing some of the biggest names in philosophy.
He did. Scholars are still debating the finer points of Suarez's metaphysics, but there's no doubt he had a lasting impact.
It's amazing to consider the breadth of their intellectual contributions. So considering all of this, what do you see as the lasting legacy of the School of Salamanca?
Well, figuring out their exact influence is tricky, you know. There are ideological biases, people didn't always cite their sources directly, things like that. But their role in the development of international law is undeniable. That separation of ius gentium from natural law, the defense of the rights of non-European peoples, that's a big deal.
Absolutely. And their contributions to economic theory are increasingly recognized.
Right. And their ideas about resisting unjust rulers, those had a real impact on political thought too. Plus, they made significant advances in logic and metaphysics.
And it's fascinating to think that Soto might have even influenced Galileo's early ideas about mechanics. That's a connection I never would have expected.
It is, and after a period of being kind of overlooked, there's been a renewed interest in the School of Salamanca since the 1930s. People are starting to appreciate the full scope of their contributions.
Well, it's clear that the School of Salamanca provides a powerful example of what it means to act as philosophers. They weren't just preserving old ideas, they were actively engaging with the biggest challenges of their time, applying their knowledge to real-world situations, pushing the boundaries of thought.
Exactly. They weren't content with just sitting back and observing. They wanted to understand. They wanted to act. They wanted to make a difference.
And their attempts to reconcile tradition with the rapid changes happening around them, their efforts to grapple with the ethics of globalization and colonialism, their work in law, economics, metaphysics, it all offers so much insight into the challenges we face today.
It really does. And it gives us a model for how we might approach these challenges in our own time.
It makes you wonder, what are the defining challenges of our time? Are there parallels to the upheavals they faced? And how can we, like them, act as philosophers to develop thoughtful, ethical responses?
Big questions, but important ones. And I think engaging with thinkers like the School of Salamanca can help us find our way.
Absolutely. So, to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to delve deeper into the School of Salamanca. Check out their writings, explore the scholarship. It's a journey worth taking. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.